Hello, everyone. This is Amy Spagnolo from the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions at Rutgers University. I'm happy to be here today with Rita Cronise, my colleague and friend, presenting on peer support, the state credentials, continuing education, and retention and recruitment strategies. This webinar was originally hosted live on February 6th, 2020, by the National Council for Behavioral Health. But we experienced some audio quality issues and decided to record this session so that we can provide all of the information that people may have missed due to that poor audio quality. So thank you for tuning in and listening. We're going to start off with a couple of slides that are plugs for the National Council for Behavioral Health. And specifically advertising their national conference. So the two individuals that you would want to contact for any member support services questions that you might have are Neil Comstock, the Director of Membership, and Joel Nepomuceno, the Membership Manager. Joel, I apologize because that's a hard last name to pronounce. But on this slide, you'll see that their email addresses as well as their phone numbers are listed. Additionally, there was a handout created for this webinar that will be available on the virtual community website for the Academy of Peer Services, and we'll be sure to give you that full website as we progress through today's discussion. The next slide that I'd like to show is the actual advertisement for the National Council Conference that's being hosted this year in Austin, Texas, from April 5th through the 7th, and registration is now open. So if you visit the National Council website, you'll find the registration form, and you'll get to see the agenda and the plans for that conference. They have some really important speakers lined up. Brene Brown, Carla Harris, Johan Hari, and Johnny Taylor will all be at the event providing keynote speeches on each of the days. So we're going to move into our discussion of peer support, specifically, as I noted just a couple minutes ago, state credentials, continuing education, and recruitment and retention. So Rita, if you'd like to take it over, it's all yours, and I'm happy to move your slides.
Okay, thank you, Amy.
Welcome.
I'm Rita Cronise, and I work as the lead designer for the Academy of Peer Services, which is the New York State Peer Certification Project. I also am distance faculty at Rutgers University, and I think we might want to talk about the goals and objectives for this program.
Yep. So I'll lead us through that. We're going to definitely cover some of the roles that peer support specialists play in the behavioral healthcare workforce. We'll spend some time describing kind of the national overview of certification and point you all to some really helpful and timely resources to learn more about your individual state. We'll discuss some of the recruitment and retention strategies that help support the development of the peer support specialist workforce. And we'll also provide some examples of continuing education opportunities and career development for the peer support specialist.
Okay. So again, I'm Rita Cronise, and I am a person with a lived experience of a mental health challenge, and I've been involved in peer support for many years. In fact, it's been 20 years now since I left my 5th psychiatric hospitalization and walked into the room of a peer support group, where I learned that I didn't have to go to the hospital to get some of my needs met. In fact, a lot of my needs were met right there in peer support, and I've been an avid fan of peer support ever since. I have also a master's degree, a master's level education in instructional design. So it's been really a blessing to work with Rutgers on this Academy of Peer Services, where I take my professional expertise and my personal experience with peer support and combine them. So what is peer support anyway? When we talk about peer support, it's really about bringing hope to people. And I'll just share the SAMHSA definition of peer support in a behavioral health setting. And I'll talk a little bit more about the distinctions between behavioral health and professional settings versus peer support in peer-run organizations. But within professional settings, peer support workers are people who have been successful in the recovery process, who help others experiencing similar situations. Through shared understanding, respect, and mutual empowerment, peer support workers help people become and stay engaged in the recovery process and reduce the likelihood of relapse. Peer support services can effectively extend the reach of treatment beyond the clinical setting into the everyday environment of those seeking a successful and sustained recovery process. So again, this comes out of SAMHSA, and it's a definition of peer support that comes from more of a clinical perspective. And what we'll also talk about today are more about the individual peer support and support that's offered through peer-run organizations, because there are some clear distinctions between the two. So where do peer support specialists work? There's a gamut from crisis to wellness and everything in between. There are peer supporters in inpatient units and emergency rooms where peers provide comfort and support in these treatment settings. There are also peer-run respites that are completely outside of traditional treatment that act as hospital diversion programs, and these peer-run respites are largely and often completely run by peers themselves. And then there's transitional services where people are discharged, when people are discharged from hospitals or released from prison, to assist in returning to the community. So they're in peer-run organizations, they're in behavioral health. They assist with housing. They assist on ACT teams, assertive community treatment teams. They are in the VA. They provide advocacy. They provide crisis response, and they're also in criminal justice and supported education and employment settings. So there's many different places where peer support specialists work, and the work in many ways drives what it is that peer support specialists do. But going back to that previous slide, in all cases, the real intent of peer support is to provide hope that things will get better and that there are ways of dealing with whatever the life challenges that somebody is experiencing. How are they paid? So next slide, please. So we often hear about Medicaid reimbursement, and that is true. Peer support specialists are being reimbursed by Medicaid in these traditional treatment settings, but peers have been volunteers really since the beginning of time. And even in the VA, which is a traditional treatment setting, peers are providing support in volunteer roles, which are called without compensation, or WOC. So peers sometimes quite often volunteer their services in all kinds of different settings. When you think about breast cancer or epilepsy or diabetes or any of the chronic kinds of illnesses where peers come together to help each other, those are largely volunteer roles. In the 1980s, particularly in mental health, the community support program started to fund research around the idea that there was a benefit to peer support potentially as a paid profession in 1998 through 2006 that demonstrated well-being, the increase in well-being among study participants, and a greater increase in well-being among those who use these consumer-operated services. There was a significant effect on well-being for users of drop-in, and really any type of service they saw an increase in wellness and an increase in recovery. So how are they paid? Peer support through the community support program was recognized as an evidence-based practice, and that caught the attention of Medicaid, and in 2007, reimbursement started coming from Medicaid CMS. But again, we so often hear about Medicaid reimbursement. Funding comes from other places as well, and the handout will give a lot more detail, but they come from federal sources, they come from state sources, they come from things like psychiatric hospital downsizing, from community reinvestment and community redevelopment, from grants, from managed care organizations, from charity groups, from fundraising activities, and from many different entrepreneurial ventures. So it has been been funding for peer support for a long time, and there still is. Medicaid has become the largest focus because that's where the most funding has come through. But with Medicaid funding comes some restrictions. And I'm going to go back to the peer-run organizations. Next slide, please. Just to give an example of, within the peer-run world, peer-run organizations, one particular kind of program that's offered is the peer-run respite, which is a hospital diversion program in many ways, and peers just come and work with other peers around many different kinds of crises. And the funding for these comes from the sources that you can see in this pie chart: 45% through county or local, 36% through state revenue, 7% from SAMHSA, 5% from managed care, 3% from private organizations. And this is one kind of peer-run organization. Others include drop-in centers, homeless shelters, employment support services, housing support services, and transitional support services that help people to come from the hospital to the community. So Bridger programs, you may have heard of peer Bridger programs. They go into the hospital, they work with people while they're in the hospital, and then they provide supports when they come out to the community. There's also many jail reentry and prison reentry programs, and there's many programs like RAP. So a lot of these different peer-run programs are also receiving services, and I'll talk about why that's important to really know about in a few slides down. Next slide, please. So we hear a lot about Medicaid reimbursement, and we hear a lot about, the fact that states are getting reimbursed for Medicaid. And the way in which states do this is through two particular options that will fund the reimbursement of peer support through Medicaid. One is through a state plan amendment, usually under the Medicaid rehab option. Another is through a waiver program, like the home and community-based services waiver. With these come some restrictions, however. Next slide, please. In the guidance to the states from the Medicaid director, peer providers should be self-identified consumers in recovery from mental health or substance use disorders. And each state has to define for itself what the training and credentialing is, based on whether they have a Medicaid waiver or whether they have done a state plan amendment in order to include peer support services. So the training is specific to each state, care coordination is specific to each state, and supervision is specific to each state. And supervisors must be provided by a competent mental health professional, and again, that is also defined by each state. So supervision is different in the states, the training and credentialing is different in each state, and it's all driven for those that are receiving Medicaid reimbursement by each individual state's certification authority. Next slide, please. Now, of course, we don't have time to talk about all 50 states and each state's particular certification requirements. So in order to match the state plan or waiver, each state has come up with their own, and there's a report that's issued every 2 to 3 years on how each state has implemented peer support in their state. Next slide, please. As of the last publication of this statewide report, which is issued by the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health, as of the publication, which came out, the last one was issued an amendment was issued in 2017. 41 states, plus the District of Columbia, had established state-approved training and certification programs to receive Medicaid billing. So this is all driven by Medicaid reimbursement. The average length of training was 52 hours, and that ranged from 32 in Mississippi and Wyoming up to 126 in New Jersey. All but 7 certification programs required continuing education, and 11 hours was sort of the average for continuing education for recertification. And 8 of the states required some form of work experience related to peer support, either a practicum or some kind of a supervised job. And those practicums or supervised jobs ranged from 72 to 2,000 hours. Some updates that have come out since 2017. Since then, Arkansas is now has a recognized state program. Colorado now has a state program. Nevada now has a state program. Ohio is in the development in a revision to their program. They stopped their program and they're now revising that program, which is in development. And California has been working for a very long time on a state program, and they were very close, but it was vetoed by the governor, so they're now back with new legislation that they're in hopes will establish a state certification very soon. At this point, South Dakota has no training, although there is training, but there's no state recognized program. New Hampshire and Vermont do not have a state recognized program. There are training programs in all of these states, but they're not recognized for Medicaid billing at this point. Likewise, Alaska. And as you might imagine, things are more complex. So there's a new section that's coming with the new issue of the report, which will be coming out. They're hoping by June or July. So, okay, that's probably about all I'm going to say about that, except that I did have a question about New Mexico. New Mexico asked not to be included on this report. We do not understand or know why, but we do know that there is training that is happening in New Mexico. It's just not Medicaid reimbursable. There's not a Medicaid reimbursable program there. Next slide. In the handout, we've also provided information about a peer special, on a report that came out of the U.S. Government Accounting Office that kind of looked at a sampling of peer programs and some recommendations. So you can look at that when you get your copy of the handout, which we'll give you a little bit later. Next slide. And the last thing I wanted to mention about this, the Peer Specialist Training and Certification Program report, there is an appendix that talks about the Medicaid reimbursement for peer services in each one of the states, and it does give all of the details about what kind of waiver or what kind of amendment or what kind of supports are covered under that. It's a really good resource for Medicaid billable peer support. Next slide. So beyond certification, and actually before we go beyond certification, I just wanted to mention that here in New York, we do have a peer certification. That is, we have a separate peer certification board in New York State, and we have a separate training program where our initial training is done through an online on-demand program called the Academy of Peer Services. It's the only state of the 50 that has a fully online training program. It's not the only training program. Anybody in the state can take training anywhere they want to. We, in addition to the training program, offer the certification exam. That is the first step towards certification. And even though it's an online program, the next step towards certification offered by the certification board requires 2,000 hours of a supervised work experience. And we'll talk a lot more about supervision in the next section, but supervision is one of the key issues and the key concerns in the peer, in helping people to become peer support providers. Supervision is a real key. So beyond supervision, I just wanted to mention that there are many technical assistance programs, centers that are offered, national technical assistance centers that are offered in peer support. Because it's an emerging practice, there's a real need for resources, and these centers that offer offer technical assistance are in different regions, but they all come together to provide very high quality technical assistance in the form of webinars, technical assistance in the form of newsletters and directories, and even in-person meetings. So this is some of the technical assistance centers that provide that are Brass Tacks, PeerLink, Star Center, the National Empowerment Center, Cafe TA, and the Doors to Wellbeing. And these are all available through your handout. And next slide. Another important aspect of the peer support movement is that there's a distinction between allies and the peer-led organizations themselves. And there's been a little bit of tension between organizations that are trying to define peer support for peer supporters as opposed to the peer supporters who are doing peer support, defining this growing profession for themselves. A couple of the organizations that have been really key in helping the peer movement to define itself are the Mental Health Self-Help Clearinghouse, the National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery, and the National Association of Peer Supporters, which has formerly been known as the International Association. They recently refocused their efforts on national issues, and so they are now they've renamed themselves the National Association of Peer Supporters. And all of these organizations, again, also available through your handout, have wonderful resources for more information and a lot on advocacy for the movement. Next slide. And within the substance use community, Faces and Voices of Recovery has been one of the major players, and they have a technical assistance center through SAMHSA for addiction recovery support. So they would be a really good resource. They are a very good resource for addiction recovery. Next slide. And of course, we do have wonderful allies, the National Council, NADAC, the Psych Rehab Association, Mental Health America, DBSA, NAMI. They're all organizations that have supported peer support. They, however, are not governed by peers themselves. Their board of directors are not, the way that you define a peer-run organization is the majority, it has to be at least 51% of the board of directors and the leadership of the organization have got to be self-identified peers. And none of these organizations have boards of directors that are, meet that criteria. So they're seen as allies and they have a lot of great information and useful information. They are not considered peer-run organizations, however. Next slide, please. And of course, SAMHSA has some wonderful technology transfer centers for additional ongoing education and support, and many new just practices that are being promoted through these technical assistance centers. So again, they are also available in the handout and on our website. Next slide, please. And of course, training comes through national conferences. The peer conferences that have been available have been through INAPS and Alternatives and Peer Support Canada. Canada has a wonderful program, and they're doing some amazing work up in Canada to help move the peer movement forward. Sorry, next slide. As well as our allies have their own conferences, and National Conference has the conference coming up in April. And next slide. And finally, communities of practice are really springing up everywhere with the peer support workforce. They are a way of just coming together and continuing to grow, either in getting support for each other, continuing to create best practices. There's learning communities that are happening, and one of the most important developments that's coming out of communities of practice is group supervision, where peers are coming together, particularly where supervision is coming that is not peer supervision. Peers are coming together to help supervise each other according to the values of peer support. And there are guidelines that are offered for peer support that is in alignment with peer support values, which is a little bit different than often happens in some of the more traditional organizations where treatment is the focus. And one of the reasons that I really emphasize the difference between peer-run organizations versus treatment organizations or behavioral health organizations that have a focus with Medicaid funding specifically is that when peer support comes from peer-run organizations, it's coming from a more pure place of the peer values of recovery-oriented services. And sometimes that gets lost in the transition of moving to traditional practices. Some of what's happening now is that peer-run organizations are coming together to offer peer services on contract to behavioral health organizations so that the peer practices are still being offered even in organizations where that is not necessarily the focus, and it's harder to do under the Medicaid funding streams of what has to be done within those organizations. So it's a complex issue, but if you really look at peer-run organizations and communities of practice and the ability to potentially contract peer services within organizations that don't have peer supervision, those are some of the newer developments that are happening. Next slide, please. And you'll find out more about many of these things if you check out our virtual learning community. We have many resources as far as jobs and events and research and resources. And we'll give you that address at the end of the presentation. And next slide. And so I think probably I'll end with just this quote from Bell Hooks, that one of the most vital ways we sustain ourselves is by building communities, places where we know that we're not alone. And thank you for your time. Amy?
Thanks very much, Rita. That overview of both the peer support specialist training and certification, as well as some of the funding mechanisms that different states are using, is really helpful. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to discuss some of the academic paths for peer support specialists, as well as a little bit more information on the supervision of peer support specialists. In our experience working with the Academy of Peer Services in New York State and some of our research collaborators in other states, we've noticed that there are different types of learners who are interested in the role of peer support specialist. So we've kind of categorized those on this slide. For many peers, the role of peer support specialist is their first career development opportunity. And so people who are entering the peer support specialist workforce may have been exposed to peer support themselves and have identified that peer support is an occupation of interest for them. And they may be early in their career development just in general. For others, the role of peer support specialist marks a career change option. And we've seen people entering the workforce from almost every walk of life and previous occupation. Then we have groups of people who have been providing peer support for many years in some cases and have decided, either based on their own intrinsic motivation or because their job role requires certification, to receive more formalized training or education in peer support. And then we have the last group of learners that may be interested in training and formal education because they're looking to advance their careers and move into supervisory positions. Regardless of what category people fit in, there are training and education options available to them. And that's what I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about. To give you a quick snapshot of the group of learners who participate in the New York State Academy of Peer Services training and testing platform, we organized this slide to show the education levels of the nearly 11,000 people who have registered for an account at the Academy of Peer Services website since 2015. So as you can see, the largest group of learners in the Academy, 31%, have completed some college. And this number most likely indicates and is in alignment with the national data that's available that points to the fact that there is typically some interruption in higher education that many people with the lived experience of mental health conditions experience. The second largest group of learners is those who hold a bachelor's degree, 24%, followed by those who have completed high school or a high school equivalent, around 20%. So this data tells us a couple of things, but one significant thing that it tells us is that over half of the learners in the online academy have experienced secondary education and have the skills and competencies to work on academic-like training with a certain level of rigor and demands. And the majority of those individuals are doing really well when it comes to post-testing. So one of the measures that we are constantly paying attention to in the academy is the pass rate on the post-tests. And we're finding that people are successful and able to pass the post tests in order to apply for their certification. Just to kind of focus in on this first group of learners, where we identify individuals as entering the peer support workforce as their first career. Continuing education for certification may also include steps on the rung of an academic ladder. So what we mean by that is traditional coursework offered by institutions of higher education like Rutgers and other universities may lead to academic credits that can be transferred to an associate's or a bachelor's program, or they can be used as continuing education hours to maintain peer support specialist certification. So taking academic credit bearing courses can absolutely be the first step on the academic career ladder and provide people with really good exposure to higher education, and especially for those who would like to start with 1 or 2 classes before becoming fully matriculated into an academic program. So we always suggest that people check with their state certification authority to be sure that academic credit bearing courses can be applied to the continuation or maintenance of their certification. But it's also possible that this is the entree for people back into higher education or into higher education as a first experience. The next set of slides are some options for training and academic preparation for peer support specialists. And we'd like to highlight the Undergraduate Certificate in Peer Support offered by Rutgers University. So this 9-credit distance education certificate includes 3 courses on the principles of peer support, communication techniques for engagement, and a practicum experience to help people gain some real-world skills in peer support. The other nice thing about this opportunity is that the 9 credits earned for the certificate can be applied to an associate's or a bachelor's degree in psychiatric rehabilitation, also offered by Rutgers. Additionally, some undergraduate programs in community mental health may also accept these credits. So we also encourage people to check with whatever university they're interested in applying to see what their credit transfer policy is. The next group of learners that was on that slide previously was those who are interested in changing careers. For people who are considering a career change and are interested in peer support as an occupation, there are even more rungs on the academic career ladder available to them if they have previous higher education experience. So we noted earlier that the Medicaid regulations required for the supervision of peer support specialists state that the supervisor must be a qualified behavioral health practitioner. So that individual must have supervision experience, knowledge of recovery, and also the lived experience is sometimes preferred. So qualified behavioral health practitioner typically means a person holding a graduate degree in a related behavioral health discipline and or someone who is licensed or certified. So in the states that have that requirement, we wanted to highlight one option at the graduate level that people might be interested in. So this is the program, the Master's in Healthcare Management with the Behavioral Health Track Focus. This is a 36-credit, fully online master's program that prepares experienced mental health and rehab professionals to become supervisors, managers, and quality improvement professionals in behavioral health roles. So these professionals with graduate degrees are often called upon to perform these specific tasks in the field of mental health care delivery. The course of study specifically emphasizes leadership skills needed for advancement to administrative and supervisory positions, but also includes classes in management, supervision, organizational and program development, as well as a firm background in the empirical basis of psychiatric rehab. In addition to the core requirements of this master's, the behavioral health track courses also include important content about the practices that promote recovery, such as psych rehab, evidence-based and promising practices, and wellness and recovery. So this is an option for graduate study that's, again, completely online. I'd like to switch gears just a bit and hone in on one of the objectives that we noted at the start of our webinar, which was thinking through and paying more attention to the recruitment and retention strategies for employers of peer support specialists, or those who are interested in employing peer support specialists within their organization. We know that many organizations have effectively incorporated the peer support specialist role into the array of existing behavioral health care services, and that other programs are completely peer run and operated. But regardless of the type of setting, which Rita reviewed earlier, the need for recruitment and retention strategies for peer support specialists still exists. So we're going to spend just a few minutes reviewing some of those strategies. Like any other profession, it's important that agencies spend the time adequately considering how peer support providers will be incorporated into existing services to ensure that quality individuals are hired and that those individuals stay within the organization. I think all of us can recognize how time-consuming and costly it is when we're experiencing high rates of staff turnover, and that the training is also expensive. So according to our virtual learning community, Job Bank, which Rita mentioned earlier, there are currently over 100 unfilled positions for peer support specialists advertised in New York State just on our website alone. And other states have similar job banks that are being hosted by peer support advocacy organizations. And we really encourage you to find out which organizations are hosting job banks and start to get familiar with what those job positions look like. So let's take a closer look at what's been found to contribute to the recruitment and retention of this workforce. Something that's overlooked but critically important is the need for a clear job description. So several surveys and studies conducted both by our Rutgers research team and other national groups have indicated that one key to the successful hiring and maintaining of qualified peer support specialists is a clear job description with accurate job tasks that match the philosophy of peer support. So really staying true to the philosophy of peer support in the way that the job tasks and the description is provided. A second aspect that affects the satisfaction of the peer support specialist is the culture of the organization and the value that the organization places on the unique talents and contributions of the peer support specialist. So the prep work that goes into ensuring that the incorporation of the peer support specialist into existing teams is incredibly critical. The third factor influencing satisfaction and success on the job for peer support specialists is having a supervisor that understands and advocates for the peer support role. Additionally, we're seeing emerging evidence that indicates peer support specialists would prefer that the supervisor is also a person with a shared lived experience of mental illness and/or has provided peer support themselves. A living wage is a factor that spans nearly every profession, but we see some significant disparities between peer support providers and non-peer support providers in similar job types with similar academic and professional experiences. So this is an area for increased advocacy. And then finally, we see peer support specialists wanting opportunities for career development, including training and access and support for advancing their formal education. Some of the resources that we wanted to highlight for hiring, supervision, and retention are on this slide. This is in addition to the multitude of resources that we have provided in the handout. We just wanted to highlight the New York City Workforce Integration of Peer and Community Health Worker Roles, which is a needs-based toolkit to advance organizational readiness. And we're planning some webinars around utilization of the toolkit for spring. And also the Philadelphia Peer Support Toolkit, which is a fantastic resource that you can find online just through a simple search. So kind of just to summarize the key points from the webinar and to highlight some of the areas that you can find on the handout resource. We talked about certification and funding mechanism for peer support workforce, some options for continuing education and communities of practice across the country, ideas for people who might be entering or re-entering higher education and advancing their progress on the academic career ladder, and then just a few highlights for recruiting and retention strategies. All of these areas are critically important to developing the workforce, and being able to incorporate peer support specialists into the existing array of services offered in behavioral health care settings. So I just wanted to also highlight that the aps-community.org website is provided for you there on the left hand of your screen, and this is for the virtual learning community. From there, you can also be linked to many of the different websites that we described today on the webinar, and also to the Academy of Peer Services and the Rutgers Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions, where you'll find more information on the certificate in peer support and the Master's in Healthcare Management Behavioral Health track. So that's what I have prepared for you today. Rita, is there anything else that we want to highlight before we conclude our session?
Well, I think we might have one more slide with our contact information, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, we do.
And that's how you reach us.
Good point.
And thank you, Amy. That was great. And, you know, I always think of a million things that I wanted to say during and didn't, but one other resource for supervision that I think would be really helpful is the National Association of Peer Supporters. It's in the handout, but I just wanted to call it out. They have a repository for supervision resources, and it has just literally, you know, many different guidebooks and many different presentations and training programs that are available for supervisors to better understand the role of the supervisor in helping peers to uphold their own values, the values of peer support. And one tool that we just launched that NAPS, the National Association of Peer Supporters, just launched, I'm on the national task force for that, it's based on the national guidelines for peer supporters that was developed in 2013, and we've added one new supplement to it on the role of the supervisor to help peers to do that. So I just wanted to highlight that one resource for supervision. Thank you.
Great, thanks Rita, and thank you all for listening.